There's a new development in the case against a man accused of murdering 4 University of Idaho students in 2022 in their off-campus home.
And the accused killer of 4 Idaho college students, Bryan Kohberger, expected back in court next month.
You guys, Bryan Kohberger from the Idaho Moscow murders has officially announced an alibi, and we're going to take a look at it right now. Okay, so back on November 13th, 2022, 4 University of Idaho students were found murdered in their off-campus house in Moscow, Idaho. Their names were Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin, Kaylee Gonzalez, and Madison Mogan. Kaylee and Madison were best friends and had been since they were little girls. They'd been thrilled to get accepted to the same college together, and they loved living in the same off-campus house. Xana was another roommate who was dating Ethan, and he was known for his cheerful personality and constant smile. He didn't live with the other women, but he occasionally did sleep over, which was why he was even there on the night of the 13th. But first, all 4 of them spent the night out and about. Xana and Ethan went to a party while Kaylee and Madison hit a bar. They all got home between 1 and 2 a.m. 3 hours later, at around 4 a.m., Xana accepted a DoorDash delivery and she spent some time on TikTok shortly afterward. But only a handful of minutes after that, another roommate heard a sound and opened her door to see what was going on. So these 4 were upstairs, and then there were other roommates downstairs, and one of these roommates hears something, gets out of bed, and opens her door. She sees a man in dark clothes and a mask. She was too startled to do anything but stare as he walked out of the house. He didn't try to hurt her. Still, she spent the rest of the night locked in her room, just shaken up. She didn't work up the nerve to check on her housemates until late the next morning. A little before noon, she tapped on one of her roommates' bedroom door, but the housemate was unresponsive. Even after she went inside, she couldn't wake them up. She still didn't realize what had happened. She thought her roomie was just unconscious. So eventually they called 911 for a medical assistance. Now, once the paramedics arrived on the scene, they confirmed that Xana, Ethan, Kaylee, and Madison had all been stabbed to death. None of the victims had been sexually assaulted. And while some had defensive wounds, others of them didn't. It seems that whoever had killed them must have attacked them in their sleep. And they were quiet enough that some of the victims didn't even wake up. All 4 had died of their wounds almost instantly, meaning even if that other roommate had been brave enough to leave her room or check on them right away, it probably wouldn't have done anything. There was almost no way that the ambulances could have gotten there in time. The quadruple homicide was a massive news story right away, in part because the crime was so gruesome and senseless, and it didn't help that it took the police close to 7 weeks before they named a suspect or made an arrest. It wasn't due to a lack of evidence or leads, though. In fact, they collected thousands of tips over the course of the investigation, and pretty early on, the detectives found security camera footage that showed a white Hyundai Elantra driving by the student's house. It passed 4 times over the course of the night that they were murdered, almost like it was scoping out the place. Especially because a little after 4 a.m., so right around the time of the murders, it made a 3-point turn right in front of the house. Now, unfortunately, none of that security camera footage showed the car's license plate clearly enough for the detectives to read it. And they couldn't determine what year the car was from. They estimated it was a 2011, 2012, maybe even 2013. Still, it was a good place to start. Now, more importantly, they found a knife sheath at the scene of the crime. It was in Madison's bed, where she'd been killed right beside her best friend Kaylee. It looked like the 2 of them were sleeping next to each other when their lives were taken. The police never managed to locate the murder weapon, but the sheath had DNA on it that didn't belong to any of the victims. The detectives ran the genetic material through their system, didn't find any matches. That suggested that the killer didn't have a prior criminal record. So they expanded their search to seek out partial genetic matches. This wouldn't take them directly to the killer, but it would help the police see who they were related to. Now, once they knew which family to focus on, they visited a house where the murderer or their relatives might potentially live. Then they searched through the trash until they found a usable DNA sample. Once they ran tests on that material, they got a match. Not for the actual killer, but for the killer's father. That was all the police needed to hone in on their top suspect. And on December 30th, 2022, the police arrested 28-year-old Bryan Kohberger. Bryan was a student working toward a PhD in criminology, meaning he studied crime, and he'd expressed an interest in learning about the way violent offenders think. He attended Washington State and lived about 10 miles from the house where Zana, Kaylee, Madison, and Ethan were slaughtered. He drove a white Elantra, which was a perfect match for the car that had been spotted at the crime scene. After his arrest, the police searched Bryan's parents' home. He'd been visiting them when he was apprehended. They found black clothes that looked a lot like the dark-colored garments the surviving roommate saw when she spotted the masked man in their home that night. He also had gloves and a flashlight. Next, the detectives looked at Bryan's phone records. In the months before the murder, his cell phone GPS put him near the house in Moscow on 12 separate occasions. A lot of the time, this was very late at night, which again kind of made it sound like he had spent some time planning the murders, familiarizing himself with the area, maybe even trying to work up the nerve to go in. On the night of the homicides, his phone was off from 2:47 to 4:48 a.m. So there's no record of where he actually was during the 2 hours. But that said, right before the phone shut off, he was on the road headed toward Moscow. According to prosecutors, it seemed like he turned his phone off specifically to prevent any investigators from putting him at the scene of the crime. Except Bryan also reportedly came back the morning after before 10 a.m., almost like he wanted to see if anyone had found the bodies yet. But if the police were able to determine a motive, they haven't announced it to the public yet. The victims' friends and family members all said they had no idea who Bryan was. It didn't seem like he knew any of the students who were killed. But clearly, there was intention there. The evidence suggests that Bryan specifically targeted this house. And it was interesting that the murderer took the lives of Zana, Ethan, Madison, and Kaylee while letting the other two roommates who were down on the bottom floor live, especially after one caught him in the act. The crime wasn't random, but nobody could have guessed at why Bryan might wanted to commit it, assuming he did. Of course, prosecutors don't have to prove motive to get a conviction, and they thought they had plenty of evidence to take Bryan to trial. Except, like I said before, this case was a massive news story from day one, which meant the authorities needed to take security into account when setting a date and a location for the hearing. They expected it to draw reporters, witnesses, spectators, all kinds of other people. And in an effort to make sure they could accommodate such a big crowd, they actually kept delaying the trial. As of right now, we are still waiting for a date to be set. But in advance to the hearing, and this is what is just breaking, on April 18th, 2024, Bryan publicly released his alibi for the night of the murders. Remember, his phone doesn't actually put him there. According to him, at some point after midnight on November 13th, 2022, he was driving around just looking at the moon and the stars in the sky. According to Bryan, this was a habit he got into around the time that he began lecturing for his PhD program. He says it was a huge commitment and his workload was heavy enough that he didn't have time for his old hobbies like hiking and running. He still needed some way to relieve his stress, so he took to driving around late at night. It was the only time he had to actually get away and unwind. And sometimes these aimless evening drives took him down the street that Zana, Kaylee, and Madison lived on. The implication being that he very well might have driven past their house multiple times before the murder, just like his phone records showed. But that didn't make him a killer. According to Bryan and his defense team, it was just a coincidence. It was even possible that he drove up and down the street while the homicide was happening, while having nothing to do with it. He hasn't specifically said in detail what route he drove along that night or what time he began or ended his drive. But in fairness, when the police searched Bryan's phone, they did find a bunch of pictures of the nighttime sky. Some of those photos were time-stamped very late at night or super early in the morning. So it does sound like his alibi was at least partially true. He really did drive around looking at the sky at odd hours when most people are asleep. The question was whether he was on the road with his phone off when the murders took place, or if he was in that Moscow house. And the big problem with this alibi is that it's almost impossible to corroborate. If Bryan really was all alone in his car, that meant there was nobody to come forward and speak on his behalf. And with his phone off, he really could have been anywhere. So we'll have to wait and see during the trial if Bryan has any way of supporting his story. Whether he can or not, ultimately, Bryan's alibi is just one piece of the puzzle in this case. Prosecutors still have the DNA evidence and all those incriminating items they seized from his home. The question is whether the jury will decide that's enough for a conviction. If he is found guilty, Bryan could be sentenced to death. So the stakes are as high as they can possibly be. Right now, it looks like his trial will be sometime in 2025. So we'll just have to see how it goes then, and I'll keep you updated. I think we are going to see a lot of evidence come forward at this trial, so stay tuned.